For decades, Western countries have engaged the African continent with a mixture of aid packages that often came with strings attached. Straddled with the legacy of colonialism, many African countries were often left dependent on their former rulers to develop their economies. But over the past decade, new players started engaging the African continent, offering alternatives to the West. Russia with its security and defense deals, and China with its massive infrastructure projects and loans. But now Turkey is also trying to get into the mix with its own unique approach. Let's take a look at this report.
I'm very excited about the impact of the future of Africa on the rest of the world, including the United States of America.
We have continued and will continue to urge that there should be a diplomatic solution and process to this current conflict.
And to discuss how world powers are engaging the African continent, joining me now from Nairobi is Alex Vines. He is the director of the Africa program at Chatham House. And from London, Jihad Mashamoun. He's a research fellow at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at Exeter University. A warm welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me on Straight Talk. So, Alex, let me begin with you. What do you make of America's new strategy for Africa, which was made public in 2022? I mean, how has that played out in the last year, you think?
Well, it's played out in a number of ways. First there was the second US-Africa Leaders Summit in Washington, D.C. in December, where the majority of African leaders attended that. And secondly, we've had a lot of footfall now of American officials visiting the African continent. The most recent is Kamala Harris, the Vice President of the United States. And later this year, there's a plan for President Biden to visit the continent. So the strategy is fundamentally about showing that the United States is re-engaged and serious about Africa. And underpinning it is a concern to particularly compete and contain China and secondarily Russia.
Mm-hmm.
That's continuity in US policy. It's not new, but it has been even more clearly expressed in the new strategy.
So, Jihad, what are some of the political or maybe social hurdles the US could face while investing in the continent and revitalizing its relations with the African countries?
Thank you for having me. And yes, that's a great question. I mean, looking at the U.S. strategy towards Africa, it seems there's a lot of hurdles, and notably that It's calling for, of course, democracy, advancement of democracy in the region. However, if you look at the region itself, certain allies of the U.S., they're not actually democratic themselves. So basically, there's a reality is different from what is hoped for by the U.S. administration. Secondly, and this is most important, I have to emphasize, the U.S. actually, from hindsight and from looking at the situation, the U.S. doesn't really want to stay in Africa or the Middle East. It actually wants to go to Southeast Asia to counter China. And also at the moment, if I may add to Alex's point of view here, is that it sees Russia as a secondary enemy.
You think so? Would you agree, Alex? Is this a secondary element for the U.S. to confront the Chinese and Russian influence in the continent? And could you talk to us about this Chinese strategy? I mean, has Beijing been able to fill the gaps left by Western powers there?
Oh, certainly the Chinese over the last 20 years has significantly invested in the African continent, given that there's plenty to invest in, so plenty of opportunity. But the United States had certainly retreated. Corporate America is not very present in the continent in the way that it should be. And China has provided infrastructure, it's provided loans, and it has become a important partner for a number of African countries. I think both of us agree that Russia is a secondary consideration, and so Russia is certainly irritating to the United States, and there are a few countries where Russia is kind of dominating at the moment. So that's the Central African Republic and Mali in particular. There's real concerns that Russia might be trying to meddle now in Sudan through its private military company Wagner. Let's see how that plays out. But China is really the big concern for the United States in terms of geopolitics, but also Africa is important for the United States for critical and strategic minerals. And so locking in those supply chains for the United States in competition with particularly China is a real preoccupation and real priority for Washington.
So, Jihad, if Russia is a secondary element, let's say, in the continent and is just an irritant, why do you think so many African nations stayed neutral over Russia's attack on Ukraine? I mean, what's at stake for them to remain neutral?
What I understand mostly about Africa staying neutral is that, again, most of African relations with Russia stems from the liberation period era in the 90s, during the Cold Wars in the 90s, when America was siding with one side in Africa against another side. If we look at, for example, even the trade agreements between the arms trade agreements, between African leaders and Russia, it's much more substantial compared to the U.S., with some exceptions. For example, if you look at Sudan, Sudan has $1 billion worth of arms agreements, armaments from Russia. And it has been using the Port Sudan agreement in order to get America to understand that democracy is a secondary objective for Sudan, to the military. Now, the second, and it leads me to a second point, and this is important, is the wheat production. With the Ukraine crisis happening, there was a significant focus on African countries with how to get wheat into the continent. And Russia is actually a great producer of that, along with the U.S. already losing allies such as Ethiopia because of the civil war.
Yes.
And that is rebuilding its relations now.
So, Alex, you have mentioned previously that Russia is also engaged in Africa on the security front through its Wagner group, which has operated in countries in the Sahel region. So how was that approach impacted its relations with certain African countries?
Well, the African Union, but also the regional economic communities like ECOWAS for West Africa are very clear that they don't want private military companies. There is a AU, African Union Continental Convention against mercenaryism. So I don't think this will spread enormously. You're absolutely right that that Wagner is in operation militarily in a couple of countries, Mali at the moment for sure, the Central African Republic. It has put an offer on the table to be engaged in Burkina Faso, but hasn't been realized so far. And it is active in Libya and in Sudan militarily. So what I see is that Africans are looking for how to get better security. And the Russians they have an offer on counterterrorism that they've been offering through Wagner. But your viewers should see that, for example, the president of Rwanda visited Benin this weekend and offered Beninois security to support Benin in its operations against militant insurgents. So there are African alternatives here. And in terms of Rwanda, the Rwandans have performed way better than the Russians did in late 2019 in northern Mozambique, where Wagner lost operatives and had to withdraw in early 2020. It failed. So I do think this is a complicated situation, and the Russians are going to find it more difficult to sell their Wagner package in the future because they just aren't delivering the types of security that Africans need.
So, Jihad, I see you smiling. Don't you agree with Alex on that matter?
Absolutely, I do agree with Alex on that matter that Wagner is not providing what the African leaders are hoped for, except with some by exceptions, like Mali, for instance. They asked the French troops to leave the country and called in Wagner. And then in Sudan, they called in Wagner to protect the regimes. Again, we're operating in a continent full of dictatorships, unfortunately, that are focusing on regime security rather than people's security. And the most important thing I have to highlight here is that it brings us to the question of China. It actually leads to the question of China. The reason why China is so persuasive in Africa compared to America is that China doesn't have any political attachment, doesn't have political strings, if I may say.
Yes, it just pours billions of dollars into infrastructural projects and doesn't get involved in the African countries' internal politics, let's say. I'm running out of time, but Alex, I want to just ask this to you. Turkiye has lately also become an important player in the continent with its rising diplomatic presence. Where does Turkiye fit in this East-West rivalry?
That's a good question, because the reality is that African countries, the majority of them, want to be non-aligned. So they don't want to be pigeonholed. They want an a la carte foreign policy, and Turkiye is part of that. So you can see Turkiye very influential in Somalia, increasingly influential in some of the Sahelian states. Less so actually in Sudan. It doesn't really have influence there at the moment. But there are a number of countries where African governments will be looking at to have Turkey as part of the mix, basically. So that is, I think, the future for Africa, where it is about multipolarity, not to be pigeonholed by East or West. So this is where China will have a bit of a space. So actually still will Russia, but also the United States and the EU, in addition to Turkey.
So, Jihad, where does Turkey differ in terms of its approach to the development of several African countries?
Thank you. That's a great question. Unlike other countries, Turkey actually approaches interactions or engagement in Africa as a humanitarian approach first, providing humanitarian aid, development, and social programs. Then later that transforms into other areas of engagement, such as security and defense relations, business relations, of course, is the most favorable attempt afterwards. So it has a lot of approach. If I may actually add to Alex's here, maybe, or even add some nuance to this analysis, is that regional powers are actually growing in contesting over Horn of Africa. I recall, for example, like the UAE and Egypt are actually even involved in arming factions or training troops, in Somalia,
yes,
in Puntland, and the UAE is getting support from Puntland and other regions in Somalia. So it's obviously that there's going to be a competition there between Turkey and the UAE in the region, in the Horn of Africa, and that's something to watch out for.
All right, gentlemen. Unfortunately, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining me on Straight Talk.